title of my talk is Taking a Second Look at Narrow Row Corn. And I'd like to mention my co-investigator is in the audience here, Alex Lindsay. Alex Lindsay is fairly new to our department, but he's been playing a major role in our helping me with my applied production research, as well as Alex has an appointment where he can work on a number of different crops, and I've been fortunate to get him to work on corn, because I think that's it's great to have someone with his background in physiology, ecophysiology, to help me with this. Well, what's driving the interest in narrow corn production? This is a topic that's been a hot topic for many years now. There's certainly a perception out there that narrowing corn enhances yield. I think if you asked a bunch of corn growers in a room what they think would be a key step in higher yields in the future, I think many of them would say, well, it's going to be narrow rows. Narrowing corn rows are going to be a key factor to help us achieve higher yields in the future. And I think that's media attention from farm magazines, the trade magazines. I think they keep stirring the pot on this topic. And rightly so, but a lot of times, when we hear stories about, especially this time of year, where we hear the top producers, the winners of the corn yield contest, the fact that they are using narrow rows gets highlighted often. So those growers that are getting those high 400 and 500 bushel yields, the fact that they're using narrow rows or twin rows gets highlighted. And subsequently that becomes, that there's a perception that factor, that management practice has played a key role in those higher yields. Unfortunately, we aren't able to tease out the contribution that narrow rows make in those high yield environments or those high yield situations. Another factor is higher plant populations. We've seen in the last 10 years in Ohio, we've seen an increase in higher plant populations. In 2016, over 62% of our corn acreage at harvest had final stands of 30,000 plants or more. And 10 years ago, in 2006, only 14% of our corn acreage had final stands exceeding 30,000. So we've seen a big increase in populations exceeding 30,000 plants per acre, and populations, if we look at trend lines, they're talking about, maybe in 20 years we'll be 40,000 plants per acre. So there's a perception that as we're seeing these higher plant populations increasing, we have higher yielding hybrids that can tolerate more stressful conditions. They do better at higher plant populations. At least that's what we're often told. We have greater availability and marketing of narrow row corn heads and planters, and I think the farm press, again, there's been more reports of more consistent silage yield responses to narrow rows, especially in the eastern U.S. Well, I'm not going to spend all the history of corn research or narrow row corn research is extensive, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing the past research on this topic and what people have come up with as perceived benefits or advantages with narrow rows, but I'll just point out a few. Narrow rows result in more rapid canopy formation, and sometimes that's listed as a factor that should contribute to higher yields, but typically here in the central corn belt in 30-inch rows, we get a canopy in 30-inch rows that's just as good as 15-inch rows at intercepting photosynthetically active radiation that's required for our optimal yields. The narrow rows promote more efficient collection and utilization of solar energy, and then supposedly this greater interception of solar energy should translate into higher yields. But probably the primary rationale for narrowing row spacings is to reduce within row crowding. If we can reduce crowding within the row, I think a lot of agronomists and farmers agree that this crowding within the row reduces. If we could reduce that crowding, we could enable the plants to compete more effectively for nutrients, water, and light. And this is borrowed one of your slides here, Alex, and this is just a cartoon that kind of demonstrates that. Here with narrow rows, we have a greater distribution of plants per unit area. There's greater seed-to-seed spacing, so you can see with conventional spacing versus narrow rows, we're getting a more equidistant spacing between the plants, and that allows for more efficient utilization of nutrients, light, and water, in theory. And certainly if you look at charts, this is a table that shows the minimum distance between adjacent plants in 30-inch rows, 20, 15-inch, and 30-inch twin rows. And say right now in Ohio we're around 30,000 plants per acre, and we're looking at 7 inches between plants. We go to, say, 15-inch rows, we're going to about 14 inches. So we're increasing the distance between plants with 15-inch rows. And if down the road, we even have growers now that are pushing, say, 36,000 plants per acre. But say down the road, 20 years from now or less, I think for some growers, we're looking at, say, 5 inches between the rows with 30-inch rows at 40,000 plants per acre. We'd have 10 inches using 15-inch rows. So, there's obviously the spacing, it can be documented fairly easily. What's the distribution of narrow rows in Ohio presently? Well, according to the National Ag Statistics Service, it's about less than 20% of our corn acreage is in 5% of our corn acreage is in less than 20-inch rows. And that's very similar to what it is nationally. Nationally, it's about 5%. Most of that's in 20-inch rows, actually. So what I'm going to be talking about today is actually some research we started this year. Alex and I got started on this year, and we're going to be trying to address a question that deals with several questions that confront narrow row corn producers. At the present time, maybe one reason we see only 5% of our corn acres in narrow rows is that the grain yield response to narrow and twin rows is inconsistent. Responses are slightly more positive in the northern corn belt, maybe 3% or more, but they're not consistent necessarily, that much more consistent. But the responses to narrow and twin rows in the central corn belt are negligible, less than 2%. Usually. Now, I know there's some producers out there that indicate that they do get more consistent, that do get higher yields than that. We did a study actually on twin rows several years ago. In 2011, we did a study looking at twin rows. Great Plains came out and planted some research for us, and we did it. Tony Vine did the same study. I don't know, Emerson, if you did that study looking at twin rows, and I think the consensus, and I think Kansas State was involved in that. And across the states, I don't think any of us saw a response to twin rows. And we looked at populations going up, I think, from 25 to 45,000 plants per acre. And we were looking at DeKalb hybrids that year. So we didn't see any benefits that year. But time has gone by. We haven't looked at 15-inch rows in a number of years. So we have some questions that we want to address in our research at Ohio, which again we initiated this year. Is there a yield advantage for corn planted in narrow rows, in this case 15-inch rows, compared to conventional row spacing, 30-inch rows? And we wanted to look at both grain and silage production. Because in the eastern corn belt, there are reports, as I mentioned before, that growers are finding that there are claims, and there's Cornell and Penn State research that shows that they're getting a differential response with silage and grain using narrow rows. Another question we want to answer is, do hybrids differ in their response to narrow and conventional 30-inch rows? Because this often comes up as a question. We have these new hybrids out there, high-yielding hybrids. Are some of them better suited for narrow corn production? Growers say, well, some of these hybrids, maybe that have more upright leaf architecture, would be better for narrow rows, especially when you're going to higher plant populations. Well, again, it's one of these questions that I think we all get, those of us in extension agronomists get asked about, is that most of our hybrids today have upright leaf types. They're erect or semi-erect leaf types. Very few out there, I think, are floppy. I'm surprised if any are. Really widely used hybrids are like that. Another question that we want to try to address is, does corn planted in narrow rows, 15-inch rows and 30-inch rows, respond differently to seeding rate? Again, this is a question that comes up. Are we using high enough seeding rates to optimize the use of narrow rows? So in 2016, we initiated an experiment with Penn State. Penn State was actually ahead of us here. They initiated this. They started this research in 2015, but we joined them in 2016. We have 4 locations. We have locations in southwest and northwest Ohio at South Charleston and Whiteville, respectively, and then we have 2 central Pennsylvania locations at Rock Springs and Gatesburg. In experiment 1, we're looking at yield response to plant population in narrow rows, and we're looking at, again, we're looking at 15 to 30s, and we're looking at 35, 40, and 45,000 plants per acre. And we're looking at Pioneer brand 0506. I think, Alex, this is a hybrid that one of the Penn State people found had a response to narrow rows. Their preliminary work suggested that. And then the second experiment, we're looking at the yield response of 4 hybrids in narrow rows. And the hybrids we are looking at include the 0506, 105-day hybrid, 106-day hybrid, 111-day hybrid, and 114-day hybrid. So we're spanning quite a range of maturities. We're not going into the ultra-earlies that I talked about this morning. But it's kind of interesting, the 0506 is an Aquamax hybrid, and so is the 1443. That's another Aquamax hybrid. And the 1197 is a hybrid some of you may recognize. It's a hybrid that's done particularly well in some of the yield contests, and as well as in our corn performance trial. It has high yield potential. So again, we're using hybrids in these trials that have demonstrated, especially 1197, that have demonstrated high yield potential. These aren't hybrids just selected based on a potential response to narrow rows. I've also included a study that Alex has got started this year. It's also an Ohio study. We didn't do this in conjunction with Penn State, but just to provide some additional information on narrow rows. But we did this one again at South Charleston at Hoytville. Our treatments, in addition to a control, included foliar fungicide applied at soaking, Approach Prima, a foliar nitrogen application in the form of Coron applied at soaking. I think that was about 6 to 7 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and then a foliar fungicide and nitrogen combination put on at soaking, and then 2 hybrids that varied in their disease ratings, 0825 and 0843. I don't know if Alex is here. I forgot which one of those. I think they were hybrids that we selected. They had slightly different responses to northern cornleaf blight. Is that right? Okay, and we collected, our measurements included grain yield, normalized difference vegetated index, plant and ear height, final population, stock lodging. We collected dry matter, and that was our attempt to get an idea of silage, estimates for silage, and then ear weight and kernel yield components. And what I'm going to be talking about today is our in-season measurements that we collected. Normalized difference vegetation index, which we're trying to use to quantify hybrid differences and differences in canopy closure. And we did this using a Trimble Greed Seeker handheld crop sensor. And then we have information on final population and silage yield estimates and grain yield. Let me start talking about the information for NDVI that was collected at the V10, the V11 stage, the 10-leaf collar, 11-leaf collar stages for hybrids, planted in 15 and 30-inch rows, again for those 4 hybrids. And for row spacing, we found that at Hoytville, but not at South Charleston, we saw significant differences in the 15 and 30 inches. Our NDVI readings were higher for 15-inch rows. For hybrid, we didn't see any differences at South Charleston, but we did see differences at Hoytville. And we didn't see any interaction at either of the sites. The hybrid responses or the hybrid NDVI levels, we didn't detect differences in hybrid NDVI levels at either location. Well, let's move on to grain yield responses to seeding rate in 15-inch and 30-inch rows. And in this particular figure, we have South Charleston on the left and Hoytville on the right. We have our 3 seeding rates, 35, 40, and 45,000 plants per acre, and our yields here on the y-axis. And we're looking at the 15-inch responses are in red, and the gray indicates the 30-inch responses. And we did see evidence of some differences in response to narrow rows. Now, we also noticed that, I also have a note here. I took out your information on, I think, seeding rate, Alex, but the NDVI was greater for V11 for the 15-inch rows than 30-inch rows. That was true at both locations. And it seemed to me, Alex, that our NDVI readings were usually more consistent for row spacing than they were for seeding rate. But what we found was that the yields in 30-inch rows were optimized at 40,000 plants per acre, and in 15-inch rows at 45,000 plants per acre. Now, the test we did this year gave us an opportunity to look at narrow row responses across some very different environmental conditions. At South Charleston this year, we did have warm, hot, dry conditions in June and July, but they didn't have the impact on crop performance as they did at Hoytville. The yields at South Charleston were almost 100 bushels or 75 bushels greater than they were at Hoytville. Hoytville, on our heavy clay soils, even though we got some rains late in the season, our yields were much lower there. And at Hoytville, we didn't see any differences in response to 15 and 30-inch rows. This figure shows the dry matter yield response to seeding rate. It was kind of our attempt to get an idea of silage. This is, again, same sort of setup as I showed you in the previous slide. And here we're looking at we're estimating this at tons per acre. And again, we did see differences in NDVI between the 15 and 30-inch rows. That didn't translate into differences in tonnage because we didn't see any significant differences between associated with row spacing. Okay, what about Hoytville? This is up north where we had the more stressful growing conditions. Again, didn't see any significant differences in dry matter production, which again kind of surprised us this year as far as our dry matter production. I guess I was expecting to see maybe a location where we might not see yield responses, but we might see dry matter responses. Okay, let's move on to South Charleston for the 4 hybrids in 15 and 30-inch rows. Again, this is set up kind of similarly to the others, but on the x-axis here, we've got our 4 hybrids, the 105-day hybrid on the right, and then going to the left, going to our higher maturities. So here we're looking at the second experiment, where we're looking at the grain yield of 4 hybrids in 15 and 30-inch rows. At South Charleston, we didn't see any differences associated with narrow row spacing. 15 and 30-inch rows were general. We didn't see differences for the 105, 106, or 111 or 114-day hybrid. We did see that one of the hybrids had much lower yields, the 106-day hybrid. And that was due to the fact that hybrid was hurt by lodging pressure that it experienced. We had some heavy winds at the end of August, and that hybrid appeared to be much more sensitive to stock lodging than the other 3 hybrids. Let's look at dry matter yields for the 4 hybrids at South Charleston. Didn't see any differences. They were between the 15 and 30-inch rows for these 4 different maturities, hybrid maturities. However, we did see differences among the hybrids at this location. The dry matter yields were greatest for the 111-day 1197 hybrid, and that was similar to the 114-day hybrid. And then this figure shows the grain yield of the 4 hybrids in 15 and 30-inch rows up at our northwest location. And this is the site where we experienced, again, the stressful conditions. And you can see the yields of 2 of these hybrids were different in the 15 and 30-inch rows. The 105-day hybrid, we actually saw higher yields associated with the 30-inch rows. And again, you can see these yields were really reduced considerably by the stress conditions in the 105-day hybrid. And we saw a different response for the 111-day hybrid, the 1197, which I thought, again, it was kind of, I wouldn't call it necessarily a racehorse hybrid. It was kind of surprising, though, that it was actually the highest yielding hybrid under these stressful conditions, whereas the 105 and 114-day Aquamax hybrids weren't as competitive to that hybrid. But at this location, we saw that in 15-inch rows, that hybrid did better than at 30-inch rows. Okay, for Hoytville, again, we didn't see any differences for silage yield estimates. There were no differences in dry matter observed across the row spacings. For the fungicide and nitrogen effects on hybrids planted in 15 and 30-inch rows, the 15 and 30-inch corn spacing at the 2 locations had no influence on disease, earleaf nitrogen, and yield. And none of the foliar fungicide applications impacted disease levels, which were very low this year, which was kind of surprising given the conditions we had late in the season. But we had more gray leaf spot than we had northern, but I don't think disease levels overall exceeded 10%. And yields among the treatments were similar to the untreated control. Well, let's change gears now and look at the Penn State data that we had. This is from Greg Roth, who's the corn agronomist over at Penn State, and this shows the grain yield response to narrow rows at Rock Springs, and that's abbreviated RS in the tables, in the figures here, and at Gatesburg, G. And I've kind of consolidated the information in this one. I've got the results for the seeding rate study on the the 2 bars, or the 4 bars on the left, and then the 4 bars on the right indicate the results of the hybrid study. And at this location, we did see evidence of differences or row spacing effects. One in the seeding rate study and one in the hybrid study across these locations. However, there was no yield response to seeding rate in the 15 and 30-inch rows. They were the same. Yields of hybrids in the 15 and 30-inch rows were the same also. Well, what about our estimates of silage? I'm using a different term here. I'm using biomass instead of dry matter. But again, we're trying to estimate silage here. And in Pennsylvania, they did see responses. There was evidence of differences in response to row spacing. 2 hybrids differed in their response to row spacing. The 105 and the 106-day hybrid showed greater dry matter production in 15-inch rows than the 111, 114. We didn't see the evidence for the full season hybrids. And that was consistent with what the Penn State researchers found in 2015. They saw the 105-day hybrid also showed responses in that year as well. So overall, what did we see this year? This was the first year of what we hope is going to be a 3-year study. The red bars in this figure indicate the Ohio State data. The blue bars indicate the Penn State data. And what I'm trying to show here is the yield advantage in bushels per acre for the 15-inch rows. So you see several asterisks here. And so what we saw in 3 of the 10 field experiments, we saw that the narrowing rows, 15-inch rows, increased yields. In one of the Penn State studies, we were getting close to about 9%. There was a 19-bushel increase. 13-bushel increase in one of the Penn State studies. We had a 4-bushel increase. And we actually had one location where we saw a negative response to narrow rows. So our summary then, answering those questions I mentioned earlier, did hybrids differ in their yield response to 15-inch and 30-inch rows? Hybrids had a differential yield response for grain at Hoytville, but a similar response to row spacing at South Charleston and the 2 Pennsylvania sites. Hybrids had a differential response to row spacing for dry matter at Gatesburg, one of the central PA sites, but a similar response in the Ohio studies and the other Pennsylvania study. The NDVI values at V10 and V11 did not predict grain yield or dry matter yield. Does corn planted in 15-inch rows and 30-inch rows respond differently to seeding rates? Basically, does narrow row production alter the optimum seeding rate? Well, differences in grain yield response to seeding rate at 15 and 30-inch rows were evident only in one study. The optimum seeding rate was greater in narrow rows. Yield at the optimum seeding rate was similar regardless of row spacing. Is there a yield advantage for planting corn in 15-inch rows compared to 30-inch rows? In Ohio, the grain yield was increased in 1 of the 4 studies, decreased at 1 of the 4 studies. In Pennsylvania, grain yield was increased in 2 of the 4 studies. In dry matter, yields were increased in 2 of the 10 studies, and those were both in Pennsylvania. So 2016 provided us with a range of growing conditions. I didn't mention, but the Pennsylvania studies were performed under very favorable growing conditions this year. Last year they had more stressful conditions, but they were looking at yields well into the 200s this year, so they had very favorable conditions for it. We had a more mixed bag in our state, and therefore, maybe this accounted in part for some of the yield response to row spacing that was mixed this year. And we plan to try to do the study in 2017 and 2018. We received a DuPont Pioneer Crop Management Research Award grant to conduct this study. And we also were very fortunate to use a 15-inch corn head that we borrowed from Michigan State. And that made life a lot easier. We didn't have to hand harvest these plots.